That's right, it's time for another springtime review of a seemingly random expanded media venture. My interest in Big Finish's output has evolved quite significantly over the years. When I first started listening to their work, I stuck rigidly to the full cast productions. The main range, the 8th Doctor adventures, the 4th Doctor adventures, and so on. My mentality was that of preferring total storytelling immersion in my audio dramas. I wanted the original on-screen actors to be fully performing these adventures, as opposed to them stopping to blatantly narrate actions that could be conveyed far more imaginatively with implicit dialogue, while also attempting to impersonate their dead colleagues. 'Twas a presentation preference, and while I confess I do still somewhat feel this way to a degree, eventually my 60s Who bias became so fierce that I just shrugged all that off and I started becoming more invested in the Companion Chronicles, Early Adventures, and the 1st and 2nd Doctor Lost stories anyways. Of course I did. I'm not claiming to be the ultimate authority on them though, as I haven't gone out of my way to collect every single one, and also most of the time I'm perfectly satisfied by the first 2 Doctors' TV adventures anyways. But if I go into, say, the Who shop and one happens to be there, chances are I'm leaving with it. But yeah, for the most part they're fine. Nice little entries that expand on tiny pockets of potential that the 60s occasionally missed out on. And in 2019, they capitalised on one such hypothetical idea that we as fans have formed in retrospect. Doctor Who had monumental celebrations for its 50th anniversary, more low-key affairs for the 40th, and commemorative serials for the 30th, 25th, 20th, and 10th. But what if it had indulged in a special outing for its 5th anniversary? Now, an episode did happen to air on Doctor Who's 5th birthday. On November the 23rd, 1968, episode 4 of The Invasion graced our screens. Now, if you ask me, I can't think of a better way to herald 5 years of the show than with Kevin Stoney, an extravagant helicopter shootout, and the reveal that the Cybermen are back. But Big Finish wanted to go a little more grandiose than that. What if Season 6 had commemorated the occasion by attempting a multi-doctor affair, a half-decade prior to the 3 Doctors? Enter Daughter of the Gods, an entry in the Early Adventures range featuring the 60s Who talents of Fraser Hines, Peter Purves, and Wendy Padbury. Yes, I put on the reversible cover. The plot? Well, to put it briefly, the premise centres on the 2nd Doctor, Jamie and Zoe, accidentally causing and visiting an alternative timeline where the 1st Doctor, Stephen and Katarina, never arrived on the planet Kemble and thus didn't prevent the Daleks' master plan to create the universe-threatening Time Destructor. An intriguing idea, though producer David Richardson admitted that a hypothetical 5th anniversary celebration in 1968 probably wouldn't have been as continuity-laden as this. Indeed, I myself imagine that any multi-Doctor outing made in the 60s would have been a bit more conventional than what this audio demonstrates, possibly setting the earlier Doctor's events into a narrative gap within his own era like the actual classic series multi-Doctor serials did, rather than having him be the result of an alternative offshoot timeline. But this is certainly a fruitful notion, and Richardson specified that the choice to tie this adventure into the Daleks' master plan was due to that serial's dramatic weight and significance in the decade's overall output, as a way to really celebrate 60s Who in general. What's more, writer David K. Barnes elaborated that this premise gave him the basis of a compelling conflict between the 2 Doctors involved. After all, with the Daleks undefeated and subjugating the universe, history needs to be corrected for the sake of time itself, but doing so will ultimately ensure the death of Katarina. Katarina is quite a unique case in Doctor Who history. Hastily introduced as a replacement companion for Vicky at the end of The Mythmakers, producer John Wiles very early on considered her to be a far too challenging character to keep around long term due to her primitive attitudes and background. So in episode 4 of the Daleks' Master Plan, this dead-end character was literally given a dead end, in an extremely dramatic way that went on to be one of the most defining moments of the First Doctor's later tenure. As a result of that, as well as her already fatalistic mindset where she believed she was already dead and on a journey to the underworld the second she entered the TARDIS, she is essentially a character defined by her demise and how it affected the Doctor, especially since she was his first travelling companion to die on his watch. It's certainly an investing subject that I don't blame anyone for wanting to explore further, but just as John Wiles found it challenging to keep the character around, it's also challenging for expanded media writers to really do more with her, as there's no narrative gaps during her time on the TARDIS to explore, and, well, you can't exactly do stories with her when she's dead, can you? Although they certainly tried. But essentially, an alternative history is the only feasible route you could really take Katarina, and using her unavoidable tragic death in the main timeline as the emotional crux of the adventure, as well as the wedge between the first and second Doctor's characters, is a natural choice for a conflict. So on paper, I'm down for this adventure. Maybe a bit fan-servicey, sure, but that's Big Finish for you. I'm on board, but a story concept is merely one side of the coin. How about the execution? Yeah, it's good. This audio drama is structured thusly. Episode 1 is told from the perspective of the second Doctor's team as they inadvertently alter the timeline, arrive on the planet Urbinia where a crisis is unfolding, get swept up in the chaos, and eventually their plot thread dovetails into that of the first Doctor's. Episode 2 then explores the first Doctor's perspective by flashing back to what he's been getting up to on Urbinia in this alternative timeline, witnessing the cause of the aforementioned crisis, and ultimately it ends by syncing up with where episode 1 had concluded. Episodes 3 and 4 then continue the adventure from this point with both Doctors' perspectives in tandem. It's an intriguing structure for a multi-Doctor outing. Certainly not a first for Big Finish, of course, but that storytelling method does lend itself well to this genre of adventure, and I'm somewhat surprised that it hasn't been utilised more often. That said, episode 1 itself doesn't exactly make the best first impression, if I'm honest, as it comes off as rather insubstantial and paint by numbers. After Zoe causes the diverging timeline, the main bulk of it is taken up by the second Doctor, Jamie, and Zoe basically stuck in a panicking crowd. The world building isn't particularly great here, and frankly kind of generic, as we get a brash security officer and a couple of odd thug looters, bruv, and very little else until the Doctor and Zoe encounter Stephen at the spaceport near the cliffhanger. Also, I have a bone to pick with the characterization early on. It's been expressed by some expanded media writers, particularly by Justin Richards, that the second Doctor can be notoriously hard to pin down, due to it being difficult to convey both Troughton's animated performance and his Doctor's bumbling yet scheming demeanour. As a result, there's quite a few expanded media entries out there where the writers compensate by over-exaggerating his traits to sell their depiction of the character, and not gonna lie, that's the vibe I got from the second Doctor in the first episode. Very, oh crumbs, let's go play with some remote-controlled racing cars and make bangers and mash, oh no, something's gone wrong, and so on. Credit where it's due, he does settle down in time for the emotional core of the story, and I'll get to that later, but I did find his earlier portrayal kinda distractingly over the top at first. The first Doctor sorta suffers from this as well at the beginning of episode 2. My boy, I'm senile and extremely oblivious to other people's misgivings with me. However, the story does start clicking for me once we get a deeper insight into the Doctor and Katarina's bond. There's a scene in this episode where they sit down and discuss her troubled state of mind and the psychological impact of her believing herself to be dead to the point where she's suffering nightmares, and the Doctor continually reassures her that she is in fact actually still alive and that she has nothing to worry about. He also emphasises that her lack of knowledge doesn't equate to her being unintelligent, which, if you've seen my Chris Boucher video from way back, you'll know that's a message I also strongly value in Leela's character as well, so its application to Katarina here is pretty sweet and, if you like, a metatextual rebuttal to John Wiles's dismissal of the character. Thematically deep? Anyway, it's at this point in the narrative where the consequences of the Doctor having been absent to prevent the construction of the Time Destructor start to become evident, with Urbinia's twin planet being aged to dust in the wake of an approaching armada of Dalek ships, and Urbinia itself being their next target. The Daleks are represented as more of an unstoppable force of nature in this outing, to the point where the admittedly rather two-dimensional Urbinian head of state has a nervous breakdown and abandons his post after first contact with them. Knowing the context of just how damn threatening their Time Destructor scheme was in the Daleks' master plan, and knowing that this is a timeline where they actually succeeded at it, it serves as a pretty ominous moment of realization that raises the stakes dramatically, and then leads into the mass evacuation riot depicted in the first episode. Unfortunately, I don't think this added context retroactively improves my issues with episode 1, but it does improve the story in the moment, especially when the first Doctor's events reach where the second Doctor's had left off. So once both storylines are caught up at the midway point, we get a couple of honestly really natural character pairings. Jamie accompanies Katarina in their struggle to evade the invading Daleks, and their primitive perspectives and idolising viewpoints of the Doctor make them a really fitting duo. Meanwhile, the second Doctor leaves Zoe in the company of Stephen, and their common futuristic backgrounds lend them some great chemistry. And then, of course, we get the interplay between the Doctors themselves. By this point, my issues with them early on are completely faded, and we just get damn banging multi-Doctor content. And not just in terms of delightful bickering, but also in terms of interpersonal drama. It's here where the second Doctor explains to the first that neither of them are meant to be here, and that this crisis on Urbinia would have been preemptively prevented had he not accidentally altered his former self's intended trajectory for Kemble. However, he also feels his former self is entitled to know that the correct timeline involves Katarina's demise in the process of stopping the Daleks. It's a great emotional dilemma between a Doctor who already knows and remembers that it happened, and a Doctor who should have experienced it and is faced with the reality that it must. And naturally, he is extremely reluctant and standoffish to cooperate despite the current stakes. Some great content here. Once both TARDIS teams are reunited, the second Doctor himself then goes on to have a conversation with Katarina about the subject, where he explains the situation, his current emotional guilt about her death, and his former self's mindset. A direct comparison is made between this scenario and the Mythmakers. The first Doctor prioritizing Katarina's well-being over Urbinia's relates to his actions in her native Troy, where he built the wooden horse for the Greeks in order to rescue Vicky from Trojan imprisonment. It's a smart and kinda niche parallel to make, and it informs Katarina's understanding that not only should the correct timeline resume for other people's sakes, but that the Doctor is not a god as she believed him to be. He's just as flawed as anyone else. Of course, this being an alternate timeline, no one but the second Doctor remembers this, but it's some great character content nonetheless. So after a distraction and a quick rush back to the TARDIS through Time Destructor effects, the solution to the alternative timeline is honestly very yada yada, as the second Doctor, I think, throws the TARDIS into the heart of the original collision and corrects the first Doctor's trajectory to Kemble. Yeah, even Zoe points out how nonsensical it kind of is. In retrospect, I think episodes 1 and 2 should have been more truncated to give this resolution more space to breathe. Whatever. In the end, the second Doctor, through the fog of the correcting timeline, assures Katarina that he'll never forget her. And that pretty much wraps up Daughter of the Gods. Is it perfect? I wouldn't really say so, as I think it's kinda lacking in terms of world building and some of the plotting, but it does hit it out of the park where it really matters. The dramatic stakes and the emotional core concerning Katarina and the Doctor's remorse for her. But of course, the million-dollar question at the end of this is, does it serve well as a fitting hypothetical what-if 5th anniversary multi-Doctor affair? Well, it's certainly a good outing that pays tribute to the first two Doctors' eras in a neat and pretty unique way. But, with all due respect to Big Finish and everyone involved with this drama, I prefer what we actually got on the 23rd of November 1968. But that shouldn't be taken as an insult by any means. If anything, it just shows how highly I think of the eras it's paying homage to. It's hard to top perfection, am I right? You know, speaking of multi-Doctor stories that feature the second Doctor... Oh no. I've become inspired to do more Troughton-themed videos again. Will this channel ever know peace? Find out next month.